Yeah. Okay. Um, let's keep moving on. So we were talking about contingent beings, a being that exists but could have failed to exist if things had gone differently. Um, and then we talked about Rhoda's argument or defense of the claim that every contingent being needs a causal explanation for its existence. Now we'll keep moving on in the handout. Now what Rhoda wants to say is true for one contingent being should be true for groups of contingent beings. So if my phone is a contingent being and my marker is a contingent being, then both of them combined are contingent beings, right? So I mean, if one's contingent, the other is contingent. If we think of both of them at the same time, they're both going to be contingent. All right. Now, what Rhoda wants to say then is, and we're on the handout, that it seems like all contingent beings, the group of every contingent being, will also be a contingent, and so, by his principle, since it will also need a causal explanation. Now, on the handout, does it matter even if there were an infinite number of contingent beings? And Rhoda wants to say no. On page 91, he uses an example of boas, but I'm going to explain this in my own way. And to do that, I want to explain two types of cosmological arguments. One part you don't have to know for a test or anything, but I think it's just good to know. So throughout the history of philosophy, it's kind of arisen two types of cosmological arguments. One, which is not our focus, is something called a Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam, known for a school in Islamic philosophy in the medieval ages. And the Kalam cosmological argument argue that since, if you have one thing causing another thing, causing another thing, causing another thing, causing another thing, and so on, or one thing causing another thing, causing another thing, causing another thing, causing another thing. Okay? Now, we can't go back forever. There has to be some start to it all. And so from there, the Kalam cosmological argument argues that there's got to be some cause that started it all. That's the Kalam cosmological argument. And that is not the argument that Rhoda is talking about. That's the Kalam argument. Aquinas used it, a version of it. It's actually a hot topic today. If we had more time, I would love to spend a unit on just the Kalam cosmological argument. But instead, we're going to focus on what's going to be called the contingency cosmological argument, and that's the one that Rhoda's focused on. Now, one thing Rhoda wants to make clear is, for his argument to work, the proponents of the Kalam cosmological argument want to say things like you can't have an infinite regress of causes. They just can't go back forever. The contingency cosmological argument, in this version, was defended largely by Leibniz. Says the argument's different. It doesn't take a stand on whether there's an infinite number of beings or not, or infinite number of regresses in the past. It says, even if it goes back infinitely, you still need some explanation for why we have this infinite regress in the first place. Okay, even if it goes back to infinity, maybe one way of drawing that is if there was never a beginning and it just goes back forever, infinity on either side. Okay, either way, you're going to want to ask, well, if this whole thing's existence is contingent, then we're still going to want to ask, why does this whole infinite chain exist in the first place? And Leibniz is going to want to say, Rhoda's going to want to say, well, we need some explanation for why this is there rather than not. Why this infinite chain is there rather than not. And that's the version Rhoda is defending, following Leibniz, and this is the contingency cosmological argument. Now, that was just more of a side for you to learn, but that's the sort of argument that Rhoda is defending. Now, Rhoda uses a similar example with boas, a daughter boa, a mother boa, a grandmother boa. Even if it went back forever, we're still going to wonder, why are there boas in the first place? Okay, with that background in place, Rhoda then wants to say, now one way to get out of this problem, if everything needs a if every contingent being needs an explanation, you could try to get out of this as in avoid God as the ultimate cause, or just having a necessary being as a cause, is maybe allow for self-causation. So you could argue that instead what happens is you might have self-causation in this way. That thing, sorry, it's countered. That dot causes that dot, which causes that dot, which causes that dot, which causes that dot, which causes that dot. So you might just have a circular causation. There we go. The camera makes it everything reverse. But self-causation, Rhoda wants to say doesn't make sense. And the reason is, he says, something can't cause itself to exist because it'd have to already exist to cause anything. Okay? That's the gist. You can't cause yourself to exist because you have to already exist in order to cause yourself to exist. And that doesn't make sense. That's why Rhoda wants to rule that out. Okay. Now, I've made 2 points that I think are pretty interesting and worth discussing, which is Rhoda right, first, that this infinite regress of causes is going to need a further cause for why that infinite regress of causes exists in the first place? And 2, is self-causation possible? Yeah, so those are a couple things to discuss. I might even start some threads if people aren't starting them on their own. Now we're at Rhoda's argument. Rhoda's argument goes like this, and this is at the top of the next page. And it's also in the book, but on page 94 to 95, and I'll just read it. Premise A: the entire group of all contingent beings that have ever existed has a causal explanation. That's what he's just been defending. That causal explanation must involve the existence of a necessary being, or more than one. Okay, why? Well, if you're trying to explain all the contingent beings, then you can't appeal to another contingent being to explain all the contingent beings unless you're going to want to run into circular causation, which we said doesn't make sense. That means whatever causes all the contingent beings has to be some ultimate necessary being, something that explains why all the contingent beings are there, but it itself doesn't need an explanation for why it's there because it's a necessary being. It couldn't have not existed. And then we lead to proposition C, the conclusion. Therefore, there is at least one necessary being that provided or played a crucial part in the causal explanation of the entire group of all the contingent beings that have ever existed. Okay, so there we go. Now, so far he's only argued that there's a necessary being, a being that couldn't have failed to exist. It's not quite God yet, but he's going to argue a little bit more later, and we'll talk about this in the next video, whether the being could be like God or not. Okay, I'm going to deal with one objection, and then deal with the other objections and the other points in the next video. Now, one objection that he deals with on page 95 says that maybe the necessary being got everything started or got something started, but is no longer still around. Okay? How does Rhoda respond? Well, a necessary being, if it exists even at one point, has to exist at all points. Remember what a necessary being means, right? It couldn't fail to exist. So if you admit the existence of a necessary being at some point, let's say a few thousand years ago, okay, that means it's the sort of thing that couldn't not exist. It's necessary, right? That means if it exists at any point, it exists at all points. And that's what it is to be a necessary being. And that's the first objection, and we'll start on the second objection in the next video. Excuse me. All right, there we go.